Today I'm here and I'm so excited to talk about a subject that I have personally grappled with ever since graduate school, so nearly for 20 years, which is what essentially is Korean American Evangelical Protestantism. So as many of you in this room know, Korean Americans have the largest Protestant population among all Asian Americans. We know this. We also know that the majority of second-generation Korean Americans grow up in Protestant homes. And thirdly, we know also that those second-generation Korean Americans that grow up in Protestant homes tend to remain Protestant over time so that they maintain their Protestant affiliation. Thus, despite fears of a silent exodus, that great numbers of second generation are leaving the church, well, that's largely unwarranted because they may be leaving the first generation church, but they're not leaving the faith altogether. So given this, today I'll speak about the substance of that faith and religious practice that is being transmitted from the first to the second generation. So the question that I'll be grappling with today is, what is Korean about second generation Korean American evangelicalism? And this would be less of an empirical paper, but rather a theoretical paper that digs into the existing studies to shed light on this question, which is what is Korean American Evangelical Protestantism. And I'll be doing this by exploring the literature that exists on the subject. So when we look at the literature that does exist about the transmission of a Korean evangelical Christianity, we can divide this literature into two main perspectives. What I term first the assimilationist, religion supersedes ethnicity perspective, and the second, pluralist, hybrid ethnic spirituality perspective. So these two perspectives, I'll speak in turn about them, that capture understandings of what is being transmitted from the first to the second generation by way of a Korean evangelical faith. So the assimilationist, religion supersedes ethnicity perspective, we can trace this somewhat to one of the classic theories within the assimilation literature that has been constructed to explain how the children and descendants of European immigrants have incorporated over time in regards to their ethnicity as well as their faith. Now, according to one of these theories, triple melting pot theory, the descendants of immigrants will over time lose their ethnicity but not their religion. So over time, what happens is that in America, and this is in a 1950s context, the theory was constructed, we'll have a Jewish pot, Catholic pot, and Protestant pot. So everyone will assimilate religiously so that their ethnicity will decline but not religion. So a third generation Irish American Catholic will come to identify primarily as Catholic and lose their ethnic Irish identity. So in the context for second generation Korean Americans, including, this would mean that they will come to identify predominantly as Protestant. So I am Protestant first and foremost would be the response. And secondarily, some other identities, including ethnic identity. And as Dr. Min and others have pointed out, there's certainly reasons for this because the conservatism of evangelical Protestantism, saying that there's only one Christianity and there aren't ethnic Christianities. And there's also a desire to escape into a broader Protestant identity that is not tied to ethnic marginalization. So by becoming Protestant in America, you can be rendered as more American. And so that can be an attractive feature. But when we question what essentially is this generic American Protestant identity that the second generation and the first generation as well is adopting primarily, when we look at the substance of that identity, it is not colorless and it is not cultureless. Rather, as scholars are increasingly more pointing out, it's captivated by white culture, which means that in terms of the normative ways of organizing, worshiping, preaching, and teaching, that is captured by a particular white culture, Western European cultural tradition. To a point where scholars are pointing out that the kind of Christianity that the second generation Korean Americans and other Asian Americans have, particularly among the evangelical community, is a banana Christianity. So that you may look Korean on the outside, but inside, in terms of your faith and religious practice, you're essentially like white Christians. So instead of creating a mango Christianity, well, mango is chosen because evidently it's an Asian fruit that's yellow inside and out. There's a yellow mango, I suppose. But these evangelicals are being bananas. So putting it together, faith is being passed on, but not a Koreanized faith and religious practice. Now, in contrast to this perspective, we have the Pleura Skybird ethnic spirituality perspective on the other side. And this perspective, more recently formulated, comes from a context that is much more multicultural, global, to a point where on campuses like this, we would have ethnic studies, we would have various ethnic student organizations, and point of fact, here we are, Korean American Research Center. So you have far more opportunities to find out more about your ethnic identity, and coupled with that, we're living in a global world where, for example, South Korea is a major Protestant nation. In fact, one of the leading missionary sending countries in the world. It's such a small country, and the most Protestant country in Asia. So in this global multicultural context, the second generation have the ability to construct a faith of their own instead of just embracing this white generic American evangelical identity. So via their ethnic churches, the second generation churches, they can use their churches as a cultural broker, a place, a spiritual laboratory that they can from which they could fashion an identity of their own, a faith and religious practice that is uniquely their own. So I sat here sharing Kim's somewhat recent book, Faith of Their Own, noting what the second generation are doing. They're fashioning a hybrid identity by adopting and reinterpreting elements of Korean and American spirituality. And while they create this emergent hybrid ethnic identity, these churches are providing a healing third space, ethnic religious third space for the second generation. So all their issues being in limbo between the American and Korean culture, being second-class citizens, perpetual foreigners, and having to live with the model minority myth, they can escape some of that experiences of prejudice and marginalization by being part of a community that is all their own, that lets them be who they are, and they can find comfort and homophily in such organizations. Now, what's interesting is that these organizations are true to what the Korean American experience is, while being technically open to all groups. And now one could argue that there's a conflict there, but I mean, that's no different than other American churches that have a particular culture, but claim to be open to all others. So in this case, the second generation Korean Americans are doing the same thing. And this identity that they're constructing is fluid. So what binds them today may be different from what binds them tomorrow. And in different social contexts and regions across the world, it may vary. So this is a complex identity. And moreover, talking about the complexity of their identity, they don't have a zero-sum calculation so that their ethnic identity somehow should be lowered if their religious identity is stronger, or they have to choose between a Christian versus a Korean identity. No, they can be both and. You can be both and it's fine. There is no existential crisis. So this is the third space being created under the hybrid ethnic spirituality model. Now, I just spoke of the hybrid ethnic spirituality model, but it's still not quite clear what exactly is Korean about second generation Korean American evangelicalism. And to do that, let me briefly talk about what is Korean evangelical Protestantism. So as many of the speakers here today noted already, one of the features of Korean evangelical Protestantism is that it is theologically conservative. So Jesus is the Lord and Savior, Bible, inerrancy of the Bible, important, evangelism, proselytism, important, and conservative ideals, high conservative ideals in regards to personal morality. So no to homosexuality, no to adultery, no to drinking, no to gambling, etc. And captured by intense devotional practices. So going to church on Sundays, obviously, yes, you do it. And not only that, you oftentimes stay the whole day, or at least minimally through the ritualistic lunch fellowship. And throughout the week, you may have worship services, you may have early morning prayer, Wednesday meetings, Friday meetings, etc. Importance of evangelizing, witnessing, as Dr. Min also pointed out. And of course, a feature of Korean Christianity that is most often pointed out is this Korean prayer. Korean prayer, which is more collective, more full of passion, more, crying out to the Lord in the full heart and force, and that this kind of prayer, not to mention the early morning prayer, holy mountain prayers, collective prayers, 동성기도, etc., that captures Korean American Protestant Christianity. And then organizationally, we also know that a Korean feature of evangelical Protestantism is that they tend to be hierarchical in organization. And again, as other speakers have pointed out today, patriarchal as well. So the pastor, very central position. Male-centered, and also the male pastor is the head of the church clearly. And it's a top-down hierarchy with importance of elders, male leadership, etc. And collective organization. So vis-a-vis compared to more typical American evangelical Protestant organizations, much more collective sense of 우리, us mentality, and more of a familiar atmosphere as well that characterize Korean evangelical Protestant churches. Now, having just pointed out what the Korean features of Korean evangelical Protestantism is, we can talk about what then is the Korean American evangelicalism among the second generation. And so in terms of theological conservatism, we find, yes, they too are theologically conservative. They're not what Professor Park mentioned, moralistic theistic deism. No, they are not those people who believe in a relative heaven and they don't need to go to church, that sort of thing, as a Christian. So theologically conservative, and in terms of devotional practices, also devoted. Now, one could argue not as devoted as the first generation, but relative to their counterparts in the American Protestant landscape, devoted. So I cite Dr. Min's book on second generation Korean Americans as well as Hindu second generation, noting that most second gen congregations had 2 or more extra meetings a week for Bible study, prayer, discipleship, and or social activities. So, devotional as well. And in terms of Korean prayer, again, they may not pray as much and as intensely as the first generation, but Korean prayer is something that the second generation want to maintain. That's a feature, a spiritual coming from their first generation parents in the church that they would like to sustain. In terms of organization, it's a little bit more complex because one of the features that they didn't like about the first generation church was that hierarchy. The pastor and male as the head, unquestioned authority, very authoritarian male-dominated leadership. That's something that many did not like. But nevertheless, they didn't want to do away with all Confucian cultural hierarchy altogether because they do cherish this kind of respect for elders and wanted to give the pastor's position greater authority. So pastors are more respected. They would like to do that towards a pastor, be more respectful relative to other Americans. And patriarchal organizations, similar. Now we can debate whether that stems from Confucianism or just conservative evangelicalism, but patriarchy is also there among the second generation churches. And this desire to create a more collective, familiar unit via their churches. So this also continues among the second generation. So I rapidly went over what might be Korean about second generation Korean American evangelicalism. And I started with the question, what is essentially Korean evangelicalism? But I actually end with more continuing questions because depending on your perspective, depending on your interpretation of what's happening, you can say it's actually assimilation and decline, or you can say it's pluralism, it's this construction of a new hybrid ethnicity. So on each point that I discussed, like theological conservatism among the second generation, the assimilationists can say, well, they're not theologically conservative as much as the first generation, hence sign of decline, hence sign of assimilation. And same with devotion. They're not as devoted as the first generation, so it's a sign of decline and assimilation. And same with organization. They're not as hierarchical or collective as the first generation. But at the same time, the ethnic hybridized perspective can say, but they are conservative, they are devoted, and they are hierarchically organized, particularly relative to the broader American Protestant landscape. So, depending on the perspective, the debate and the question persists. But I don't want to leave with ambiguity because the world is ambiguous enough. So I would like to end with one thing that we can be certain of in regards to this question, which is maybe perhaps you may argue is not so certain after all. But one thing for certain is that this debate will persist. It's going to persist for the second generation. Is it evidence of decline, assimilation? Or is there evidence that actually they're creating and refashioning Korean heritage and Korean Christianity in their own terms? And I guarantee that this debate will persist even to the third generation. Thank you.